This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Do we have a deal, Mr. Reagan?
You know, I know this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll continue our discussion of how the Nazis conquered civil society. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about this from the Nazis' perspective. We noted the ways in which they coerced individuals and organizations into Nazifying themselves in the immediate aftermath of the seizure of power. And in a way, I guess the idea of some dictator, some kind of political party, the idea of them trying to force people to accept their ideology, this isn't something that's really difficult for us to imagine. There are plenty of fictional works, of historical works on this subject. Just to name one, think about something like George Orwell's 1984, obviously very powerful, very compelling. And so we as a society, this idea of here comes the big behemoth and they're going to kind of impose their will upon us, we're very, very aware of this notion that's out there, right? We're very familiar with it. But if you ever found yourself in a position where someone was actually trying to do that to you, actually trying to make you accept their values and their ideals, our assumption is that you would resist these efforts, especially if you don't really agree with those politics or those ideological perspectives that are being forced on you. Maybe in the end, some of you would say, well, yeah, I guess you could do enough to force me to accept something, to pretend to accept something. Maybe in the end, I might bend the knee and submit, but only after I had engaged in some period of either active or passive resistance. My son was just watching the Braveheart movie the other day with Mel Gibson. There's a great scene at the end of it where Gibson is playing this Scottish freedom fighter, William Wallace, and the English have caught him, and they're literally hanging, drawing, and quartering him. So it's pretty messy. They're like ripping out his intestines at the end, and all they want him to say is, "I submit." And what does Mel Gibson do? He yells with his dying breath, literally his dying breath, "Freedom!" Because that's the way that we think about ourselves. That's our self-conception. You can't take away my freedom. I'd rather live free or die. Isn't that the New Hampshire state motto? Don't we all love our Gadsden flags right here in South Carolina? Gadsden flag comes from South Carolina. It's the one with the snake on it. Don't tread on me. So the point here is that we cherish freedom. We would never willingly accept a kind of psychological or ideological submission, or in particular, a kind of ideological slavery. We would never willingly submit to that. Except, what if we would? I started this episode with a brief scene from the 1999 movie The Matrix, in which one of the characters, named Cypher, essentially makes this argument that submission and slavery are actually preferable to reality, as long as you aren't really that conscious of the fact that you have lost your rights. If you're not familiar with the reference, The film is about a group of computer hackers led by Lawrence Fishburne and then eventually Keanu Reeves. And they discover that reality is not reality, but instead it's a computer simulation. That at some point in the past, machines essentially conquered human beings. Machines need energy, and they figured out that they could get this energy from human bodies. So there's a kind of bioelectricity that's behind the kind of theory of the film. So basically, they just want people to exist, but they want to use all their energy. So you need to keep people in bondage. You need to keep them from even moving around because you want to take every ounce of energy that they produce, every volt that they produce. And so what the machines do is they create this virtual reality, and people kind of live in it, and they think they have freedom, they think they have life, but they actually don't. And so after taking this red pill, the hackers are able to wake the individuals up. They show them the true nature of reality. And this is where the term red-pilled has come from. Now, in the film, Reeves and Fishburne are the heroes. Cypher, played by Joe Pantoliano, is the clear villain. He's the villain because he betrays his friends, right? He takes the red pill. He realizes the nature of reality. He realizes that all the people in the Matrix are slaves. But he says, I would rather be in the Matrix. I would rather be in a state of deluding myself, of lying to myself, because that's more comforting than the difficulty of real existence. He would rather be a slave than face the brutal reality of freedom as a human being. The Matrix is obviously fiction, but the idea expressed by Cypher is one that we can see during the Nazi Revolution. As millions of Germans who are not true believers, we're not talking here about the old fighters, the guys who signed up in 1923, the guys who fought in the beer hall putsch, for example. We're not talking about the people squeezed out by the Great Depression, the people that turned to Nazism in 1929, that become Nazi voters, Nazi elected officials in 1930, 1931, 1932. We are talking here about people that are either ambivalent to Nazism or who are critical of it, who are very aware of the shortcomings of Nazism. And yet, in 1933, many of these people decide to Nazify themselves. They Nazify their institutions. They accept Nazi fascist principles. They accept and begin to replicate in their daily lives Nazi racial principles. We're not just talking here, by the way, about anti-Semitism. We're talking here about eugenics. We're talking here about sterilization. These people actively choose to embrace their own powerlessness. They willingly, and in some cases eagerly, submitted to the Nazi movement. And so the big question that we want to deal with today is, how do the Nazis do this? It is, for obvious reasons, both incredibly complicated, but also really, really, really important.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hear honest conversations about anti-Semitism, new generations reshaping their connection to Jewish identity, and first-hand stories of how our community is supporting Israel. Subscribe to Mosaic, Exploring Jewish Issues on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Or watch Mosaic at jewishpb.org.
Okay, before we get into all that, just a quick note that this is one of a number of episodes that we've done on the rise of Nazi Germany. If you're listening to the podcast for the first time, you can find a complete list of them on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also find out about some of the other episodes that we've done on European history. We also have some Patreon-only episodes on topics like the making of Hitler or the rise of the SS, and you can access these for just $2 a month via the website Patreon. If you're not familiar with Patreon, you can find a link to it on our website, or just Google History Off the Page, Patreon, and you'll be taken right there. To those of you that are already supporting us, thank you so much. Without your help, we wouldn't be able to keep the proverbial lights on. Okay, so let's get back to the big question that we're trying to address in this episode. How do we understand this Nazi conquest of society? There are a number of reasons and ways of understanding why people who, again, had rejected Nazism, had been apathetic to it. Why did they suddenly convert to it in the spring of 1933 as the Nazis are pulling down every aspect of democratic society, as they are taking away people's freedoms, as they are creating concentration camps, as they are destroying the elections and the political parties and the unions and every other thing? The most often cited reason when you ask people about this is this expectation of terror, that basically, if you had resisted Hitler in any way, you would have been sent to a concentration camp. The regime would have used kind of physical violence against you. And so what other choice do you have besides submission? This was something that we obviously saw take place over the course of our last episode. But it's also possible to overstate the impact of these legal and political developments. As I've said before, history is replete with examples of powerful dictatorships, people that outlaw sort of any opposition, people who try to force individuals or institutions to kind of bend the knee, to submit. But in almost every case, whether it happens in the short run or whether it happens, as was the case with communist dictatorships, in the long run, almost all of them eventually fail in this quest to break or to reorient people's consciousness. The Nazi project to conquer civil society is one that is really, really difficult to pull off. And so part of what we're going to see in today's episode is that it's not just about what the Nazis did to kind of force people to go along, to force people to submit, to force people to Nazify themselves. But equally important is the idea of how individuals responded to this. As all these developments are taking place, as all this pressure is being placed upon them, how do individuals react to it? That's what we're really going to talk about today. And again, part of what we'll see is that some people submit willingly. Some people don't want to have the Braveheart moment. Some people don't want to go to a concentration camp. Some people decide, of course, no one wants to go to a concentration camp, but some people aren't even motivated by that kind of fear factor. They decide to obey in advance long beforehand. Now, one of the most powerful explanations that I've heard as to why Germans jump on board the kind of Hitler train was advanced by the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt. And I've talked about this at various points in the podcast, I've talked about it in other lectures, but this is the idea of the banality of evil. This term comes from Arendt's 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. She's basically writing about this SS officer named Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was responsible for kind of the logistical aspects of the Holocaust. And in the book, Arendt argues that Eichmann is not a monster. Eichmann is not motivated primarily by anti-Semitism. He's not sort of fanatically racist. He doesn't really even hate Jews to some extent. So if we want to understand why did he participate in the Nazi system, why he was very aware, of course, what was going on. How do you participate in genocide? The answer isn't in a kind of idea of hatred. The answer is in other sort of aspects of modern bureaucracy and in sort of human psychology. And in particular, when she's looking at Eichmann, she says, what are his real goals here? It's not that he hates Jews. It is that he is kind of in some ways a loser. Someone that wasn't sort of socially valued, someone that people didn't look at him and go, oh, wow, this is an amazing person. But that's what he wanted. Because at some level, We all want a degree of social recognition. We all want a degree of career expansion or career advancement. Everybody has a kind of self-conception of themselves, or they want to have a self-conception of themselves as being a someone. Whether you realize that through becoming president or senator or, some sort of political achievement, whether you write the best book about German history and millions of copies of it are sold, whether you start a business and you have a lawn care company and you built a successful lawn care company, whether you're a parent and your idea was just, I want to be a parent, I want to raise good kids, I'm concerned about morality. We all want to think about ourselves as being important in some way in society, whether you think of that in terms of like being, again, part of a bureaucracy, or whether it's just kind of on the moral idea, religious ideals, values, right? Somewhere out there, there's somebody that's coaching a Little League soccer team or Little League baseball team because that's what they love. So if we want to understand the banality of evil, what Arendt is arguing is that people look to fulfill that idea of self-recognition, and they find it by career advancement. They find it, as Eichmann did, by becoming an expert in something. Eichmann sells himself as being an expert in the Jewish question, and that gets him career advancement, that gets him social recognition. And so why is he participating in genocide? It's for these kind of very opportunistic means. To kind of bring this all together, it's the idea that people do things out of political, economic, or social expediency, not necessarily for ideological purposes. So if we look at the story of the Nazi Revolution, we can see plenty of this kind of careerism or opportunism in the way that individuals who, again, did not believe in Nazism, were, again, ambivalent about it, didn't like it, were critical of it. The way that these people kind of jump on board the bandwagon, a lot of it is opportunism. Now, there's a number of examples that I could give you here, which are Germans who decide to jump on board the bandwagon because of money. All right, there are financial reasons. And of course, we should note that this is not a particularly German phenomenon. I'm recording this in early 2026. We've just lived through some pretty significant changes here in the United States in terms of politics. We had a presidential election in 2024. And one of the really fascinating developments about that election is the way that certain tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg had a kind of ideological change of heart, in some ways kind of in the run-up to it, right, when they thought that Trump was going to win, and certainly after they saw that Trump won. In the past, these billionaires had been strongly critical of President Trump. And yet, after his victory, suddenly they decide, well, actually, we like President Trump quite a bit. They responded to his election by firing or demoting some of the people that criticized President Trump in their businesses. They replaced them with people that he liked, and of course, they started making large donations to various causes. One of the big kind of changes that happens, of course, is he's building this ballroom at the White House, and it's being funded by private donors. And Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg are right there to kind of write checks. Like, we want to give you lots of money. Now, I'm going into this not because of President Trump. This isn't the place to discuss that, right? This isn't about politics. The point that I'm trying to make is to point out how these people changed ideologically almost on a dime, and not because there was some kind of like clear moment or clear event that happened, or the president came out and said, well, I have a new policy, or I'm changing my mind about, this thing. It's pretty obvious that these sort of sudden conversions were driven by political or economic expedience. If you want to see a tech billionaire who kind of ideologically moved or converted, or however you want to describe it, but who kind of moved over to more of what President Trump believes in, you have a great example in Elon Musk. So again, we see this kind of expediency, and it doesn't just happen with President Trump. It's just a very obvious example with someone like Bezos. But we have these types of examples that are playing out in Nazi Germany. One of the earliest, clearest examples of this kind of financial opportunism, or practicality, if you want to call it that, this happens in February of 1933. This is less than a month after Hitler has been appointed chancellor. This is before the Reichstag fire. This is before the Enabling Act. This is before Dachau. There isn't really a strong physical threat of violence in February of 1933, unless you want to count SA men kind of going after communists on the streets. But the Weimar Republic as a state, with all of its institutions, with all of its legal protections, right, it still exists. So at that time, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, who was the head of the powerful kind of Krupp defense firm, this was actually at the time the largest company in Europe. Some of you may be familiar with it because it's always kind of tied to weapons development, arms sales, right? This is a massive kind of European defense company, but a specifically German one. So Krupp gets invited to this kind of conference with Hitler and other leading industrialists, again, in the middle of February 1933. Now, Krupp is actually not a huge Hitler fan at this point. Krupp had been critical of Hitler in the run-up to the 1933 appointment as chancellor. But as the head of one of Germany's largest and most important firms, Krupp is obviously a player. Krupp is the type of guy that when decisions are being made about the economy, you want to kind of get his take on it if you're chancellor before you kind of launch into wholesale changes. Krupp expected, even though he wasn't a big fan of Hitler, even though they didn't have a close relationship, he expects, okay, I'm a big deal. The Nazi Party obviously wants to work with me. They're going to listen to what I have to say, or at least be exposed to it. I'm going to get to meet with Hitler, just like I have with previous chancellors. I'm going to prepare a little presentation. I'm going to try to explain to Hitler about why some of his socialist ideas are bad. And so he literally does this. He prepares this kind of meticulous presentation. He's going to oppose some of Hitler's ideas, such as tariffs. He's going to talk about, why he shouldn't do socialism, why he should sort of fully embrace capitalism. And so he walks into the meeting again thinking, I am going to influence the leader. He never actually, however, gets that chance. One of the funny things about Hitler that people just don't really seem to get in the moment is there's always this expectation of, well, Hitler will listen to what I have to say. Hitler is not really like a deep listener, right? Hitler is not empathetic. He's not trying to go out and find out, what do all these people think? Hitler is a talker. Hitler is, come to my meeting and I will lecture you for an hour and a half on what I think, and then I don't care what you do. You're not going to really have a chance to respond to me, right? The purpose of a meeting is for you to listen to what I have to say. Maybe some of you have professors like that. At any rate, Krupp goes to this meeting along with a number of other industrialists, and Hitler goes into this hour-and-a-half-long diatribe. He talks about economics. He says, don't worry, guys, I believe in private property. But he also talks about politics. He talks about the Weimar Republic. Again, it turns into this kind of typical political speech. Now, in addition to this, Hitler also says the March 1933 elections that are coming up, these are going to be Germany's last elections. He is very explicit about the program of building a dictatorship. He tells them, I don't really even care what the results of the election are. I am going to take out the communists one way or another, be it legal or not. Now, Krupp at this point, even though he's a big wig, even though he's a big deal, he's come with his presentation, he hears the diatribe, and by the end of the hour and a half, he kind of realizes this is not really the time for me to kind of push back. Hitler's not here to listen to what I have to say. I guess I was just supposed to be here to listen to what he had to say. He's going to keep private property. Okay, that's fine. We haven't really gotten to the truly shocking moment of the story yet. Because once Hitler leaves, Goering comes in. And Goering says, you know what, even though Hitler said, I don't really care what the results of the March election are, we're taking out the communists, he's like, this is actually a pretty important election. And the Nazi Party is kind of teetering on the verge of bankruptcy at this point. They've just run a number of campaigns. We talked about 32 in the summer. We talked about 32 November. We talked about the presidential election. The Nazi Party is running out of money. And so Goering comes in and kind of points this out and says, look, we have this election coming up. We could really use your help in this. And then he adds kind of cryptically, in fact, people who are not physically participating in the revolution, in the movement, people that are not going to meetings, people who haven't joined the party, that's okay. You don't actually have to sign up, to be a party member. You can still help out financially. Wink, wink. Then Goering, of course, reaffirms this notion that this is the last election. He says the coming election would be, quote, the last for the next 5 years, probably even for the next 100 years, end quote. But it gets even better. Because as soon as Goering leaves, Hjalmar Schacht, who is basically a former liberal, he was a member of the German Democratic Party, but by this point he's kind of gravitated towards the Nazis. He's the Reichsbank chairman. And so he comes into the meeting and he says basically, my friend Goering mentioned that, you guys could contribute. Well, I have drawn up a plan for you titans of industry to contribute 3 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party. We've even decided who can pay what. Can you imagine if you walked into a meeting like this, if you were a businessman and your local senator, local representative, governor, president, whoever, says, we're going to have a meeting. Let's talk about economics. Let's talk about your company. And then they walk out of the meeting saying, we're getting rid of democracy and we need money and we would like you to donate, voluntold here, we would like you to donate X amount of money. Would you do it? Would you just be like, here's my credit card, here's my checkbook, let me just fork over the cash right now? I think most of us, at least in our minds, would probably say, hell no. I would object to that. I would publicize it. I would rally against it. Especially now, this is you and me, right? I don't know who you are or what your position is in life, but my guess is most of you aren't billionaires. Most of you are not running the largest company in the United States or Europe right now. This guy Krupp is. He's a big deal. And so how does he react to the shakedown? Before the meeting is over, before he goes home, he agrees to it. And again, what I think makes this all the more devastating, I understand the idea of, you could be sent to a concentration camp. There could have been physical threats, right? But all of this is happening before the Reichstag fire, before the Enabling Act, before the Nazis have really begun their assault on German democracy. The men that gather at Goering's house that day on February 20th, 1933, these are some of the most powerful and wealthiest men in all of Germany. And as Krupp's notes indicate, they were aware and very critical of certain aspects of the Nazi Party program. What would have happened had they rejected the party's attempt at what was obviously a shakedown? What if they had used their considerable resources not to support and go along with Hitler, but to condemn him, to appeal to Hindenburg or to the army, to say, this guy is trying to shake us down. This isn't a good thing for society. There's clearly a precedent of getting rid of chancellors in very rapid succession. We don't know what the answers to any of these things are because these industrialists submitted. They bent the knee without any pushback. Instead of resistance, they chose conformity largely because it was the path of least resistance. Now, I'll say a few more words about this in a moment, but it's also worth looking at what this obedience won them. Because I think a lot of times when we think about these type of shakedowns, these type of deals that people make, again, the idea that I will submit, but there's always kind of a sense in the background of I'm not just submitting, I'm doing a deal here. It's a transaction. I will give you what you want. You agree to leave me alone. Right? Sometimes it's you agree to, reward me with contracts. With Jeff Bezos, I mentioned, there was a big thing about he has Blue Origin and he wants to go to space. And so he wants these kind of space contracts. Well, maybe we can do a quid pro quo, right? I think in a lot of cases, especially when you're talking about maybe not Krupp and the big industrialists, but when you're talking about ordinary people, there is this sense in their minds that if I submit, if I go along, if I agree to be powerless, then you as the dictator, the party, whatever it is, you agree to leave me alone. You just let me do my thing and live my life, and I will just withdraw from trying to assert myself politically. Instead, by giving into these threats or implications of violence, what you're actually doing is incentivizing, again, the person, the party, the institution, whatever it is, you're incentivizing them to do it again. This is true of the mafia in the 1950s, and it's just as true about conformity and Nazism. Let me give you just two quick examples of this. Krupp and his fellow industrialists' reward for funding the Nazi Party was to be accused 1 month later by the pro-Nazi head of United Steelworks, a guy named Fritz Thyssen, that they were really enemies of the revolution. Think about that for a moment. You write a check for 3 million Reichsmarks, which is a lot of money, and a month later they're saying, well, you're actually an enemy of the revolution. You're actually part of the people that were resisting. Thyssen went on to call for the election of new pro-Nazi people to positions of leadership in the group. And what does Krupp do? Because Krupp is kind of like the chairman at this point. Krupp, after some discussions, after some negotiations, Krupp goes along with it. Even after all this, on April 1st, the group's headquarters is raided. 1 month later, they are forced to fire all of their Jewish members. And even after all of that, even after trying to conform, the reality is because, especially this group of industrialists, they had a kind of an organization, a trade group, because it is not an official Nazi party organization, they are forced to dissolve it anyways. So they gave Hitler a lot of money. What did they get in return? They got their group dissolved. Now, a second example, also from this same story, is about Thyssen, who, as we mentioned, is an enthusiastic supporter of National Socialism. He is not one of these people that is going along because, well, this might be good for my business or because I want career advancement or something like that. Thyssen is a true believer. He was a big fan of the Nazi Party before the beer hall putsch. So what reward does Thyssen get for being a big believer? Well, basically by the late 1930s, Thyssen becomes disenchanted with the Nazis, in particular over their treatment of Catholics. Thyssen is also not a huge fan of violence. He's deeply disturbed by the November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom. And when war breaks out in September 1939, he will actually flee to Switzerland. His company, United Steelworks, gets nationalized. And in 1941, because he's in France, he actually gets arrested by the Vichy regime. Thyssen, the guy who was so pro-Nazi that he wanted them to, again, give up any power that they had in the industrial organization and replace the leadership with Nazis. He's such a pro-Nazi guy, so passionately for it. What happens to Thyssen? He winds up in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Now, Thyssen survives the war, and he lives out his final days in Argentina. But again, after being such a key collaborator, a key facilitator, a vociferously pro-Nazi guy, what is his reward for all that? It is exile and, again, kind of debasement and humiliation in Argentina. So what happened to Krupp? Well, after being humiliated, he became, in the words of Thyssen, a super Nazi. To show his loyalty to the new regime, in June 1933, he and a group of other industrialists, they create something called the Adolf Hitler Donation to the German Economy Fund, which, according to historian Richard Evans, raised over 30 million Reichsmarks for the Nazis. And this is happening at the very moment that the Nazis are consolidating their dictatorship. Thyssen, Krupp, they know what's going on. They can see it. And they tell themselves this lie of, well, it's just happening to the bad people. Of course, centralizing power, getting rid of these sort of legal rights that we have. This is never going to happen to me. Now, Krupp ends up, I guess, a little bit better than Thyssen did. He suffers a stroke in 1939. His company is an arms manufacturer, so, of course, they do quite well during the war. They make a lot of money. They also will benefit from Nazi slave labor policies. But Krupp, by this point, is too weak health-wise to take advantage of it. He will briefly survive the regime, also dying in 1950. But by that point, his company has been disgraced, and he personally has been disgraced. So again, it's easy perhaps to understand why some of Germany's leading businessmen turned towards the Nazis after the revolution. But we need to understand that this type of careerism is also seen at all levels of German society. As the Nazis rush to staff the German bureaucracy with loyal party supporters, it is not lost on many of the people that are kind of already working there, who are not Nazis, who maybe didn't even have any sympathy for it, who may have actually been opposed to it. But they quickly start to see who are the people that are being promoted. Well, it's people that are towing the ideological line. And so there is, in the first couple of months after the Nazis' seizure of power, this tremendous rush of people to join the Nazi party. But again, what's worth noting here is they're not doing it because suddenly they went, oh, well, maybe Hitler is right. Oh, well, maybe fascism is the way to go. They are doing it out of these baser, more simplistic human desires for career advancement. By the way, just to give you some numbers here so you understand what I'm talking about. Over the course of the Nazis' first 3 months in power, for example, 1.6 million people joined the Nazi party. That almost doubles the total number of people that are members of the party. Things get so bad that in the summer of 1933, the Nazi party actually stops accepting applications. They say, wait a minute, we got to rethink this. There are way too many fakers that are joining our movement, and they're going to water it down. We need to have a more comprehensive examination to figure out whether you can join the party. Just to give you an aside here, a comparison, again, historical, in Vietnam today, for example, there is a single party, which is the Communist Party. Now, economically speaking, Vietnam is no longer really interested in communism. It's more of the Chinese model. But if you want career advancement, especially if you want jobs from the state, you have to join the Communist Party. How much you care about Marx or Lenin or something like that is kind of irrelevant. Mao Zedong, that's not really the point. The point is just you have to be on Team Party if you want to be able to access certain positions. Again, while some Germans take the overt and crass action of trying to join the party, it's worth recognizing that you can still do this even without formally joining the Nazi party. Civil servants who want promotion or who don't want to get dismissed start saying, how do I symbolically reflect theoretically my values, but in practice, how do I reflect my obedience, my submission? I've got a great idea. Let me put on a Nazi party flag pin. And I don't want to spend too much time going on a rant about this, but it's become very common since 9/11, since I guess 25 years ago now, for politicians to wear flag pins. Like that flag pin means that they really care about America or Germany or Canada or wherever. It is one of the emptiest, in some ways, most useless gestures of patriotism, right? Oh, I'm a real patriot. I put on a flag pin. Right? You're not sacrificing anything. You're not actually doing anything different. You're just wearing that. But what it symbolizes, especially in the context of this dictatorship, is that you are on team political party. You can also do this verbally. Many German civil servants suddenly started talking in the office about how cool Hitler was, how much they liked the Nazi revolution. If you want to send a message, put a swastika flag up in your office or hang it from the balcony of your house. There are also very important negative actions that one can take to show your newfound conformity or loyalty to the revolution and more specifically the Nazi Party. One of the biggest things that starts to happen is you say, if I am a loyal Nazi, whether I'm in the party or not officially, I need to stop fraternizing with the quote-unquote enemy. I do not want to be seen being associated with communists, with socialists, and especially with Jews. Many Germans begin to internalize the idea of anti-Semitism, not because they read Mein Kampf, not because there's, centuries of anti-Semitism in German history or in the churches, as some people have argued. They internalize it because these are the rules of political and social and cultural advancement. You want to be seen with the cool kids. You don't want to be seen, what's even worse than kind of not being seen with the cool kids, is you definitely don't want to be seen with the uncool kids. People, again, internalize anti-Semitism not because they hate their neighbors, but because they are playing the new rules of the Nazi game. We're being seen as being kind to a Jew, or being seen as being kind to a social democrat, might hurt your chances of success. If I am the owner of a store and I am very open to Jewish customers, or I am seen being friendly to Jewish customers, then pretty soon people are going to start going, well, they're on Team Jew. They're on the bad team. We can't allow that. We're not going to shop there anymore. SA men are going to come and harass you. And so the idea here is that it is better to go along with the crowd in the new rules of the sort of social cultural game than it is to risk standing out. Above all else, we don't want to stand out, because once we stand out, then we might not get left alone. And so again, this all kind of fits under this rubric or this heading of conforming not because you believe in it, but conforming out of opportunism. Whether that's financial opportunism, whether that's cultural opportunism. We have examples of people like priests and pastors, people who are supposed to know better, people who are supposed to be driven not by what's going on in this world, but by what's going on in the next. And they are so concerned about what might happen with their churches that they start giving pro-Hitler Sunday sermons. They start welcoming and enthusiastically supporting the national revolution. Businesses begin to fire their Jewish employees, or they tell their Jewish customers, you know what? I don't want to do business with you anymore. I run a newspaper. Guess what? Guess how I can signal to the Nazis that I'm going along with them, how I can kind of, again, work out this deal. They'll leave me alone. I will no longer accept advertisements from Jewish businesses. This gets so personal and so intense that another phenomenon that historians have picked up on is that friends don't greet each other in the street. It doesn't mean that they're not friends anymore or that they don't care about each other. But both from the Jewish perspective and from the non-Jewish perspective, they start to say, hey, if I say, hey, Shlomo, what's up? And I say that on the public street, and everybody sees me saying it, then I might stand out and I might get in some trouble. And so they do that kind of awkward thing where, like, you see your ex and you're walking down the hallway and you're like, oh, I don't want to, acknowledge them. I'm going to look the other way. I'm going to pretend like I'm looking to the right and she looks to the right, and we don't make eye contact. These types of social interactions happen across German society, and they are a part and parcel of how society Nazifies itself. Now, I talked in the previous section about a kind of crass political opportunism, financial opportunism, this banality of evil where people are going along with the Nazis because they think it can help them get something, whether that's money, whether that's recognition, whether that's career advancement. And for us sitting here with the judgment of hindsight, I think it's pretty easy to look at that and condemn it. It's pretty easy to say, why are you selling your soul? Why are you making a kind of Faustian bargain to get some kind of material or cultural benefit now? But think about what you're giving up to get that. As Jesus remarked in the Bible, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? But what if conformity is less about what you can get than what you think you might lose? What if mentally we think about it as an attempt less to gain new stuff and benefit, and more as the idea of conserving or protecting? When we put things this way, the idea of conformity becomes probably much more socially acceptable. And so one of those things that we can see when we look at, again, how do the Nazis conquer civil society, is how widespread the phenomenon of obeying in advance was. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, it comes from historian Timothy Snyder's 2017 book On Tyranny, which wrestles with some of these same questions that we're talking about in today's episode. I will say On Tyranny is much more about the political context of 2016, 2017. It's much more a book about kind of the contemporary world, whereas this podcast is looking more at the historical example with Nazism. At any rate, one of the best examples of this phenomenon taking place in Nazi Germany comes from the story of German soccer. Now, I don't know how much you follow German soccer, how much you know about the history of the sport, but basically soccer comes to Germany in the kind of mid to late 19th century. As in many cases, it's spread by people coming from England on ships. They get off, they play the game. It's very popular. It's fun. I enjoy soccer quite a bit. It's easy to learn how to play. You don't need a lot of money or a lot of equipment. And so by the 1880s, the first soccer clubs that were solely dedicated to the sport of soccer began to appear all across Germany. Now, Germans also have these kind of Sportsvereine. They're kind of like sports organizations or clubs. They play a number of different sports within it. And so there's a long kind of history of sports culture in modern Germany. At any rate, in 1900, the German Football Association, or DFB, was founded in Leipzig. They create a sort of standard set of rules. They create a series of regional leagues. And so by the time you get to World War I, soccer has become an incredibly important sport in Germany. It is fueled in part, not just by the idea of having fun and the idea of leisure and entertainment, but one of the things that's true about soccer today and was true 100 years ago and 150 years ago is its connection to identity. Many of these soccer teams are not just random sort of business investments, but they reflect some kind of political, social, cultural identity. You have teams that are there to represent working class neighborhoods. You have teams that are there to represent merchants. You have teams that represent Catholics or Protestants. Now, given the intense loyalty sports teams often draw, one might have expected that soccer is a great place to find resistance to Nazism. Right? I have my local particular loyalty and identity. If you're a Bayern Munich fan out there, Bayern Munich is deeply tied to Bavarian identity. Why on earth would I just kind of conform to Nazism? If you look at some other countries' contexts, places like Spain, for example, you can see the idea that soccer teams are not just tied to identities, but that they also can be geographical and metaphorical spaces of resistance. One of my favorite teams is FC Barcelona. And if you look on the back of my Barcelona jersey, it says in Catalan, més que un club, more than a club. That isn't just some clever marketing slogan that somebody at Nike thought up of. That is because the club has long been associated with Catalan nationalism. When Catalan nationalism was repressed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Barcelona is a place of resistance. Whether you're talking about rooting for the team as a way of kind of rooting against the dictatorship, whether you're talking about going to the stadium and speaking in Catalan, in singing songs that are otherwise banned, soccer is a great site of resistance to politics. And yet, the reaction of German sports teams and organizations to the rise of Nazism is probably best characterized as total obedience. Already by March of 1933, regional sports associations like the Saxon Gymnast Circle begin banning Jews from their membership rolls. This isn't necessarily out of ideological conviction, but in many cases it's because they want to show obedience to the regime, and one of the best ways to do that is to racialize yourself. The German National Boxing League, at the beginning of April 1933, kicks out all the Jewish members. On April 19th, the DFB, the German Soccer Federation, announces through the magazine Kicker, which, by the way, happened to be founded or co-founded by a Jewish guy, but they announced through this Kicker magazine that, quote, members of the Jewish race and followers of the Marxist movement are deemed unacceptable, end quote. Many German clubs like Nuremberg FC or Eintracht Frankfurt had already expressed this sentiment weeks earlier. They had already begun to expel their Jewish members. They broke off contact with Jewish players. The first Jewish guy to play for the German national team, for example, was named Julius Hirsch. And by 1933, at the time that the Nazis come to power, Hirsch had played or been involved with Karlsruher FV for 27 years. 27 years of an association with the club. And by April of 1933, he is essentially forced to resign. I say essentially because he finds out the team is going to ban all its Jewish players. He sees the writing on the wall and he says, I'm going to get out of here first. Unfortunately, Hirsch just exited the club. He doesn't exit Germany. He stayed in the country until he was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943, where he was murdered. The story of Hirsch, unfortunately, is not unique or isolated. Again and again, most of the teams in Germany in April 1933, when the Nazis are still in the process of kind of constructing a dictatorship, they fire their Jewish players, they dismiss their Jewish members, even in some cases, teams that had had been co-founded by Jews, or partly by Jews. And as you can imagine, this contributes to this idea of social isolation. Imagine, again, that you're somebody who spent 27 years building something at a club. You know, many of you, especially in Europe, you're fans of soccer teams and you say, how can you be an Everton fan? Everton's not going to win the Premier League. How can you be an Aston Villa fan? Right? Aston Villa, they have a good year. Maybe they'll make the Champions League, would be like a miracle season, right? They'll finish fifth. And a big part of the answer is because it's about loyalty. It's about the idea of being part of a community. Why does Hoffenheim, Why do they show up to Hoffenheim games, even though Hoffenheim is not a big team? SC Freiburg, why do you go to those games, even if you know you're not going to win the Bundesliga? Because it's about community and loyalty. And so imagine spending 27 years building up to that, contributing to it in very fundamental ways, and then all of a sudden, with a flick of a switch, it is all taken away from you. Now, there is one exception to this, and it's a kind of limited exception, but it's one that I do want to highlight because we're talking about German soccer, and that is the case of Bayern Munich. Bayern Munich in 1933 is an upstart young club actually coming off its first championship. So it's not the behemoth of German soccer that we see today. In 1913, a German Jewish newspaper official named Kurt Landauer had been elected as club president, and he oversaw a lot of the club's transformation into a title contender. So again, this isn't just some random guy. This isn't just some random fan. This is one of the key players in turning Bayern Munich into a title contender. In 1933, however, Landauer is forced to resign from the club. Landauer gets arrested in November 1939 as part of the Kristallnacht pogrom. Now, Landauer had fought in World War I, and so because he was a veteran, he received a degree of preferential treatment, at least among German Jews. He was released, and he flees to Switzerland. And Landauer will actually survive World War II. Now, so far, most of this fits the broader story of what happens between the Nazis and German soccer teams. The reason that Bayern Munich is kind of an exception is that they still continue to maintain contact with Landauer, sometimes not even sort of so secretly or clandestinely. In 1939, for example, the team visits Switzerland, and they see him at one of the games, and the players all go over, and I don't know if they high-fived him, but essentially they greet him, they kind of hobnob with him, they celebrate with him. And so Landauer is again the kind of exception that sort of proves the rule. Even with his preferential treatment, most of his family were killed in World War II as part of the Holocaust. So again, to bring this back all together, the broader story here is that soccer, like many German institutions, accepts conformity with almost no resistance. The first German national team coach, for example, was a former social democrat named Otto Nerz. Nerz's path to Nazism starts before Hitler comes to power, so he's not like a social democrat in 1933. But once it becomes official, Nerz will join the SA. Nerz will then become an important voice of support for the regime in the sports community. He remains an avid National Socialist even after his dismissal as coach in 1936. Now, his replacement was a legendary coach. If you know anything about kind of the history of soccer, Sepp Herberger is one of the most famous, most well-known coaches in history. Someone like Knut Rockne, if you're a football fan, Paul Bryant maybe. So Sepp Herberger doesn't really care a lot about politics. He's a soccer guy, former soccer player. But Sepp Herberger understands, I better join the Nazi Party if I want to become national team coach. And so he does join the Nazi Party in 1933. Now, Herberger's legacy is slightly more complicated than Nerz's. Herberger does show signs of resistance, but not for ideological reasons. One of his big moments is the Nazis want him to have his players trained to be reservists in the military. And he's kind of like, well, I don't want my players getting distracted. I don't want them to have to do extra training. And so he's able to kind of assert some authority there. But as the history of National Socialism plays out, Herberger is kind of like, I'll do whatever is required of me. The best example of this comes in 1938, after the Anschluss with Austria. Hitler kind of declares that, well, to signal the new union of Austria and Germany, we want the team to be kind of 50-50 split between Austrian and German players. And so they put them all together. It's nicknamed the sausage team because, again, it's this kind of just putting stuff together. And Germany actually ends up having a terrible World Cup in 1938. It's one of their worst performances ever. And so part of that goes back to, again, the idea of cohesion and taking players and throwing them together. But for the most part, Herberger doesn't step out. Herberger doesn't resist. He doesn't say, oh, well, we need to protect someone like Julius Hirsch. Herberger, like most Germans, most players, most fans of the team, he simply accepts the Nazi takeover of society and normalizes it through his lack of reaction. Again, we see this across the entire sports landscape. Shortly after the Nazis seized power, for example, they put all aspects of German sports under the authority of a guy named Hans von Schammer und Osten, who was this kind of middle-aged war veteran and SA man who's going to head the new Deutsche Reichsausschuss für Leibübungen, or what we can kind of colloquially translate as the German Sports Office. Now, the DRL goes through many names and kind of bureaucratic reorganizations, but along the way, it's pretty consistently applying Nazi ideology to the sports world. Whether you're talking about professional associations, whether you're talking about boxing and Max Schmeling, or you're going all the way down the kind of social ladder to physical education classes, everything is Nazified. Everything becomes about racial hygiene. Everything reflects and reinforces the notion that Hitler is a world historical figure and that the Nazi Party's monopoly on power, the National Revolution, as some refer to it, all of this is good. In fact, in 1934, von Schammer announces the creation of a new national soccer tournament. It draws 55,000 fans to its first final. And it became so popular that when the war ends, they still have this competition, this tournament. Those of you that follow soccer will be familiar with it because it's called the DFB Pokal. It is the normal national cup championship that takes place in Germany every single year. Now, so far we've talked about ways in which the regime forced people to conform. The way people made conscious choices to conform. Whether they're doing that out of opportunism, or whether it's because of, again, this fear, I better conform or else something bad might happen to me. And obviously we can make moral judgments about such people, and hopefully, if anything else, maybe we can take some lessons about this for the future. But there is another level that we need to talk about when it comes to the idea of conformity. And that is the way that ordinary people came to normalize the extraordinary events that they were living through. We are talking here about an enormous group of people, a group with many different backgrounds, many different political perspectives. Quite a few of them were like Sepp Herberger, where they don't really care about politics. But as they watched the radical events taking place around them, they reinterpreted or rethought their environment in order to recreate or to transform conceptions of reality. In other words, they're kind of like Cypher in the course of the Matrix. They adopt his sort of motto, ignorance is bliss. I don't want to think deeply about these Nazi ideas of freedom and democracy and rights, racism, submission to the Führer. And so they focus on this idea of normality, but they transform what is the normal in such a way that it reinforces Nazi ideals. As the historian Andrew Bergerson has written, quote, normalcy offered the veil of powerlessness and insignificance. by circumscribing their responsibilities, ordinary people set themselves apart from history writ large." End quote. Another way to put this is that things were happening to them, but they reasoned they had little power to stop or influence them. Conformity became, again, in the words of Bergerson, a self-deception of innocence. This idea that I don't bear any responsibility, I don't have any power to influence events anyways, and so I will go along to get along because what other choice do I have? All that said, at the same time that they're kind of making these statements, again, they will recreate or adapt elements of everyday life in ways that reinforce Nazi ideals of community, that take Nazi ideology and put it into their daily practice. An excellent example of this phenomenon can be seen through the custom, or we might even say the ritual, of how you greet someone. Now, my guess is you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about what is the academic side of greeting someone. How should we as anthropologists understand, the way we're like, "Hey, what's up, Johnny? What's up, Jose? How's it going?" You probably haven't deconstructed that at the level that we academics sometimes do. Again, you're happy to see your friend or relative. You give them a hug. You handshake. In Europe, of course, there's a lot of kissing on cheeks. It's always kind of fun to see, okay, I'm in Italy. How many times do I kiss someone on the cheek? Is it 2 times, 3 times, 1 time? You cross the border, you go to France. Maybe it's different. Sometimes we greet each other in ways that sort of signal, you know what? I don't really like you. I don't really care about you. And sometimes there's a kind of cold hello. Sometimes it's the kind of just pro-formal, "Oh, how's it going? How are you doing?" How many times do you ask that question in life, but you don't really care about how they're doing? Right? You see your neighbor, "Hey, what's up? How's it going?" And they say, "Fine." And then they ask you, and you say, "Fine." And you didn't really even care about what they thought, and they didn't really care about what you thought, but you are basically enacting a ritual that sends certain sort of social signals. Greeting, one could argue, helps us paper over many of the conflicting identities and perspectives that we have in a mass society. When you ask how your neighbor's doing, but you don't really care what the answer is, you are signaling to some degree that you care about their welfare, even if, again, it's not like I want to know the immediate, how are you doing? But I care generally, right? If you're like, "How are you doing?" and you're like, "Oh, I have cancer," right? That's really bad, and then you probably would care. So you're doing this kind of symbolic ritual where you're signaling, you're my neighbor, you're part of my community. Even if we don't have that much in common, I still kind of care about you at a kind of very basic level. You could also argue that this is showing a lack of hostility, right? You're kind of signaling, "Oh, you're my neighbor. Are you looking to steal stuff from my property? Are you trying to, force me to something that I don't like? Are you going to I don't know, play your boombox loud in the backyard or set off fireworks at 2 a.m.? No, so you're kind of signaling to them look, I'm not going to mess with you. You're not going to mess with me. Everything is cool, right? We can coexist. So again, what's going on when we greet each other is what Bergerson calls a moral relationship of reciprocity. We are building at a very basic and yet very fundamental level the fabric of society. The idea that we're all on the same team to a certain extent. I'm a Bears fan. My neighbor's a Packers fan. When we got hit by a hurricane, I wasn't like, "Oh, well, I hope you don't have power." It's like, no, we're all in this together. Let's share. We've got some milk. It's going to go bad. If you want milk, here's some. Right? So again, this greeting is part of this basic foundational level of society. In the context of the 1930s in Germany, greetings are a crucial element in creating this idea of social consensus, and especially in this idea of creating normality. Germans greeted each other in a variety of different ways. One of the most popular is just basically to say good morning. Or you might say good day or good evening, right, depending on what time it is in day. If you're like me and you love learning languages, one of the first things you often do is you learn not necessarily the word hello, but you learn how to greet someone. Guten Tag. Right, good day. And again, with closer acquaintances, there's more of an intimate connection. You might ask, how are you? How's it going? Sometimes, again, there's a physical contact. The handshake is kind of a very American thing to do. Sometimes there's hugging. Sometimes we have things like gestures, right? Sometimes we tip our cap to someone or we nod at them. I like running. I was just running today on the Swamp Rabbit Trail here in Greenville. When I see other people on the trail, I like to nod at them or I wave to them. And I have no idea who they are, but it's part of that kind of, again, basic building of an idea of community. Of, okay, we're both on the trail together. I see you, you see me. This is cool that we're doing this together. So we have all these ways of greeting each other that signal important things in society. Socialists and communists, just to end the point with 1933, socialists and communists in the late 19th century developed this word, Genosse, or in English, comrade. They call each other comrade this, comrade that, and it's a way of signifying a lack of social distinction. If you are a socialist or a communist, you're not supposed to want the idea of social distinction. If you run into Jeff Bezos somewhere, at a conference, on a flight or something like that, you're supposed to say, well, you're a billionaire, but I'm not. But who cares, right? We're all equal. And my guess is if you went up to Jeff Bezos and said, hey, Jeff, what's going on? What's up, Hefe? My guess is that he would not look very favorably on that unless you know him personally. Now, the Nazis, of course, also have their own way of greeting each other, and this way is politicized, and it is designed to reflect the ideals or the ideology of National Socialism. This is, of course, the Hitler greeting. You say, Heil Hitler. The salutation is often accompanied by a physical gesture. You're supposed to raise usually your right arm at a 100-degree angle, and you keep the palm flat and face down. It's worth noting that this salute is not invented by the Nazis just kind of out of whole cloth. Basically, they copy it from the Italian fascists. The Italian fascists kind of borrow a little bit from the Roman tradition to come up with it. But at any rate, it's approved as the official Nazi greeting in 1926, and it's part of Hitler's buildup of a cult of personality within the party. If I'm just saying Sieg Heil, hail to victory, then I'm talking about an abstract idea. It signals a loyalty to the Nazi party, but not necessarily to Hitler himself. And so, of course, then Hitler says, no, it has to be Heil Hitler, because you are reinforcing the idea of Hitler's central role in the movement. For many years, the Nazi greeting essentially functioned as a performance of loyalty. It is a lot like those flag pins that we talked about, where I put on the pin and I show everybody who I'm for, what my identity is. But as early as July 13, 1933, Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick makes the greeting compulsory, not just for all Nazis, but for all civil servants, as well as for any party members during the performance of the national anthem or the Horst Wessel song, which, as we noted, is kind of like an alternative national anthem. The public was further warned. Again, this is at the start of the dictatorship. If you do not use the Hitler salute, that is a way of showing suspicious behavior. Nonconformity is showing a lack of loyalty, and you might get a visit from an SA man. Eventually, in 1934, they even create courts to begin to enforce these regulations. So through these coercive measures, the Nazi salute goes from being an expression of loyalty to Hitler into a form of conformity. It regularizes and normalizes the idea that Hitler is part of this cult of personality. It takes Nazi ideology and Nazi values and inserts them into everyday practices and everyday life. It places at the center of these rituals that we mentioned are so important for creating a sense of community. It places the Nazis at that central position. Moreover, since we now interpret the failure to give the salute as a political act, it is going to identify or make stand out all of those people who either reject Nazism or people like Jews who are not allowed to be Nazis. Objecting to Nazism is now no longer just a political choice, which is legitimate. We would say in pretty much any country in the world, at least from a democratic perspective, you and I can disagree about who we think should be president or whether a law should be passed, what the tax rate should be, healthcare, guns, abortion, whatever. You would say, I might disagree with you, but you're allowed to have your opinion. And I'm allowed to have my opinion. And we don't have to agree on that necessarily. What the Nazis are doing here is they are transforming this into an expression of wanting to stand outside community. If you walk down the street and you greet your neighbor and they show you their middle finger, that is a clear sign that they don't want to be associated with you. They don't want you to feel like you're part of the same community. So again, in other words, what the Nazis have done is taken this very basic social ritual and they have politicized it without people thinking about it as being explicitly political. But the consequences are pretty devastating if you don't do it. And so millions and millions of Germans who don't really otherwise care about politics will go along with it. Now, the way that I've just put this, you might get the sense that, well, this spread of this greeting has created an opportunity for resistance. But again, for many people, the idea is about compliance. In Bergerson's book on the fascization of the German town of Hildesheim, for example, which is called Ordinary Germans in Extraordinary Times, it's a very academic book, so it can be a little thick at times, but it's actually quite fascinating, especially as it addresses some of these issues anthropologically. In it, Bergerson interviews one of the people that survived, obviously not National Socialism. And she talks in this story about how her father told her. And she tells this story about how her father told her, if someone uses the Hitler greeting, use it back. Quote, times have changed, she recalled him saying. If they say Heil Hitler to you, then don't make a dumb face, but say it also. End quote. And so again, all across German society, between 1933 and 1935, the Hitler greeting becomes universal. You say it when you start school in the morning. You say it to the postman when he drops off the mail, when you go to the grocery store, before a meeting at work. In the end, you are saying this 50 to 100 times per day. And each time you do, even though you're not really thinking about it this way, you are making Nazism, fascism, the Führerprinzip, the idea that Hitler is really kind of omnipotent and everyone should just do whatever he says, the racism of National Socialism. You are normalizing all of these things within daily life. Another place that we can see this happening is involving flags. Now then, just as now, people use flags as a form of political culture. People put their values or perspectives or identities up with flags. Drive around almost any neighborhood in the South, and I guarantee you, you will see college football flags. I'm here in Greenville, South Carolina. Most of the flags I see are Clemson. Occasionally, you get a couple of USC, University of South Carolina, flags you'll see. But people, even if they didn't go to college, they love declaring their loyalties. And especially if you get in a border area, oh boy, we got to put up a lot of flags to tell people what we think. Can also put up the flags of political parties or movements. Communists love red. Socialists in Germany tended to like the red, black, gold of the 1848 tradition. Conservatives favored the old imperial red, white, and black. You also have regional identities. We mentioned Bayern Munich before. If you think about Bayern Munich, think about that beautiful blue and white Bavarian checkerboard flag. It is so distinctive, right? It is so obvious every time you see it. Think about religious identities. Think about Catholic flags, especially in a place like either Weimar or Imperial Germany, where Catholics had organized politically. There are plenty of people that want to declare their Catholicism not just as a religious belief, as a set of dogmas, but as an actual sort of social identity. So we have lots of different flags, right? But as in the case of the German greeting, the Nazis quickly used the idea of displaying flags to reinforce and to colonize daily life with fascist notions. Immediately after Hitler is appointed chancellor, the flying of the black, red, gold flag of, again, the German democratic tradition is banned. The official German flag becomes the black, red, white of the imperial era, although in many cases, basically the swastika, the Nazi flag, is used as a national flag. In September 1935, when the Nazis are announcing this sort of package of laws known as the Nuremberg Laws, these are laws that, for example, will strip Jews of German citizenship. One of the laws is actually about the flag. They officially make the swastika the flag of Germany. And later on, they will issue additional regulations that require people to fly the flag, the Nazi flag, on 7 Nazi holidays. In addition, they say, by the way, you cannot fly other flags. You cannot fly your confessional Catholic flag. You can't even fly the Imperial German flag because we're not doing Imperial Germany anymore. We've moved on from that. We've built something better, and that's Nazi Germany. You can't fly your regional Bavarian flags anymore. Germany is no longer about being Bavarian. It's about being German. It's about everybody kind of pitching in, right? We're not doing the kind of local identity. It still exists, but we're not going to celebrate that. They also use this as a way to exclude certain people. One of the things they say is because we want to enforce this idea that Jews are not patriotic Germans, that being Jewish and being German are mutually exclusive, they prohibit Jews from flying the Nazi flag. We are going to make pretty apparent the idea of who is inside and outside the kind of moral national community, and we're going to make sure that we stigmatize Jews as being outside the community. So again, flying these flags probably seems pretty innocuous, but what it does is it forces dissenters to stand out. It also leads to more conformity. If I want to be left alone, if I make that deal with myself, then damn it, I better put a Nazi flag out because I don't want to get bothered about it. There are so many other examples of this type of behavior that we could get into. Unfortunately, I don't want to keep you here for forever. But the point is that, again, there are dozens and dozens of examples, places where ordinary Germans who were not particularly enamored with National Socialism, but they were quickly coerced into realizing fascism at the level of daily life. They themselves became the agents reinforcing the notion of the Hitler principle, reinforcing the notions of Nazi anti-Semitism and the claim that Jews are not patriotic. Again, so many ways you can see this. The idea of hanging a portrait of Hitler in your house, replacing what before probably would have been Bismarck or the Kaiser. If you go to the German Historical Museum, at least you used to be able to see this, there was a German dollhouse that was there from the Nazi period, and it looks just like an ordinary dollhouse, except on one of the kind of rooms, there is this little miniature portrait of Hitler with a couple Nazi flags. The girl playing with the dollhouse probably wasn't thinking, oh my God, this is the cult of personality. This is fascism. Do I really want to put a portrait of the leader up? But what she was in fact doing was normalizing the idea that our private spaces are going to be colonized by politics. Okay, again, there's lots of examples I could give, but the basic point, I think, is pretty clear. The Nazi assault on democracy was paralleled by a similar assault on individuals' ability to develop or to assert their own ideologies, their own values, their own beliefs about what the world should look like. This assault proceeded quickly, and while it was occasionally backed by the threat of force, in many cases and contexts, force was not necessary to achieve compliance. Instead, many people submitted willingly, sometimes in the hope that they would get some kind of, again, personal, financial, career gain, maybe social gain, maybe cultural recognition. At other times, this is driven by the need, or the desire at least, to feel left alone. If I conform to the new rules, then what's the point of harassing me? I can still do whatever I want internally, as long as I've kind of signaled externally that I'm not going to challenge you. The romantic notion of freedom, so cherished in the literature and in the music, in the movies of the 20th century in the United States, in Western Europe, the Braveheart moment, like I talked about earlier, this is not reflected on the ground. This is not the reality of most people's reaction to fascism. And if you think about it, this is a pretty chilling thought. For all the Sturm and Drang that one hears on the internet about the sanctity of democracy, about how we would never give in to a dictator, to the centralization of power, or to the seizure of our political rights, the reality is that our only real defense against this is the mass weight of society not conforming to it, not agreeing to go along with it. This mass weight did not exist in Eastern Europe immediately after World War II. And so Stalin and his local collaborators were able to quickly build communist dictatorships. They were Stalinized, becoming totalitarian in their aspirations and much of their function. The same, I would argue, is true in Nazi Germany. People did not really resist. People did not just kind of check out, but instead they reacted by conforming. Now, going back to Eastern Europe for a second, when these dictatorships begin to fail economically and socially, and when people kind of stopped believing in them or stopped being willing to conform to them, what happened? They fell. And they fell in almost every case without violence, destroyed by the desires of their populations for something different. We'll get to the collapse of communism at some point in the future of this podcast, hopefully. But I bring it up here because it shows that dictatorships can be resisted. That power does not lie only in the physical ability to use violence. And we know this from our podcast, from things that we've already talked about. Recall that in 1920, the Kapp Putsch is stopped in less than a week, basically by a general strike. The people of Germany don't need an army. Or the army, of course, at that point says we're not going to get involved. So they don't need the army to put down the guys who are trying to use force to take away your political rights. So how do we as residents of the 21st century keep control of our rights? How do we guard against the type of collapse witnessed in Germany in 1933 that we've been talking about today? I'm drawn here to the words of the Czech dissident and eventual president Václav Havel, who wrote in his 1979 essay, The Power of the Powerless, on the importance self-deception plays in legitimizing totalitarianism, in allowing people to carry out the mental gymnastics necessary to make yourself believe that slavery is freedom. Essentially, Havel would argue, by telling ourselves lies, by repeating things we can or should recognize as untrue, we create the fiction that we still have the power despite having already surrendered it. Sometimes these lies are obvious. I mentioned communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. Those dictatorships are built on the idea that the dictatorship existed to benefit the working classes. Clearly, especially by the time you get to the 1980s, they are not benefiting the working classes, either materially or politically, where you have them arresting union leaders, breaking up the attempt to form independent unions, raising the prices of basic goods like meat. More often, though, the lies that are told under dictatorships are the little ones. And the biggest lie of all is the idea that if I obey, I will be left alone. And so at the end of this episode, as we think about what made not just Nazism possible in terms of the dictatorship, but what enabled it to conquer civil society, to infuse all aspects of Nazi Germany with Nazi ideology and racism, and again, fascism, and the principle that the leader is kind of omnipotent, I would highlight how critically important this idea was in terms of creating and maintaining the Nazi dictatorship. People submitted because they told themselves it wasn't really submission. And this, I think, is something to chew on as the world continues to evolve in this post-Cold War era, in this time in which we seem to be living in a spread of autocracy, of dictatorship, whether you want to talk about that in the European context, whether you want to talk about that through the idea of communism. I mentioned Vietnam, obviously China. We could talk about Russia. We could talk about Hungary. A lot of the values, a lot of the things that we believed in, at least as a child that grew up again in the 1980s and 1990s to some extent, a lot of those values are being questioned or threatened. And so I think something important is to go back to focus on, again, this question of believing lies and the consequences of it. Okay, I'm starting to drift a little bit too much into contemporary politics, so let me end things here. That's going to do it for our show today. If you found it useful or interesting, please like, share, or subscribe to the podcast. You can also give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify. If you've already done that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, if you haven't, if you enjoyed the podcast, it doesn't take very long, so just go and please do those things. At any rate, in our next episode, we'll look into the last stage of the Nazi Revolution. And again, it's one of the more important ones, not necessarily in terms of total power, because again, by the summer of 1933, you have a totalitarian dictatorship in place. But it is one that I think carries meaning for our understanding of what happens after you set up the dictatorship. And so this episode that I'm talking about is going to cover the Nazi disciplining of their own party. In other words, after you establish control of power, there are usually secondary debates, secondary kind of fights that happen in which one group or one individual winds up becoming the loser. And if you go back to the episode where I talked about the Game of Thrones and the ladder game, they lose the ladder game. In particular, we're going to talk about a guy named Ernst Röhm. We're going to pick up his story and see how he played his cards so terribly wrong. We're going to talk about how those institutions and structures of violence that the Nazis developed to fight the communists and then the Social Democrats and the Catholics. They trained those guns on themselves, on other people within their own party. And so if we're talking about moral legacies, one of the reasons that I would argue fascism is deeply problematic is not just that it takes away my right to free speech and your right to free speech and freedom of religion and things like that, but even for members of the movements themselves, they often wind up victims of the systems of violence that they create. But I'll get into that again more in our next episode. That's going to be it for now. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.